There is a question that many people around the world rarely stop to ask, but once you hear it, you cannot forget it. How can a continent blessed with more natural wealth than anywhere else on Earth still have the poorest women in the world? How can a land of gold, diamonds, oil, and uranium still force millions of women to walk miles just to find water? How can young girls, children, be asked to leave school at 12 or 13 to become wives instead of students? Why does this injustice continue, generation after generation? And that is where the voice of one leader breaks the silence. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso once said, "If you want to know whether a nation is truly independent, look at the lives of its women." He is not blaming women. He is exposing a system built over centuries that pushed women to the bottom and kept them there. Today, we go deeper. Why are African women the most disadvantaged group on the continent? And why does Traoré believe they are the true pillars of African sovereignty? If you believe Africa's awakening has begun, stay with me through this story. To understand why African women remain the most disadvantaged group on the continent, we must start with a simple but uncomfortable truth. Poverty in Africa has always weighed heaviest on women. When a nation struggles economically, the first group to feel the impact is not the wealthy, not the political class, but the women who carry the daily burdens of family, labor, and survival. Across the continent, from West Africa to the Horn of Africa, women often work the hardest jobs with the lowest pay. They farm the fields, carry water, raise children, run the household, and still find small ways to earn income. Yet they are rarely the ones who control that income. In many communities, the economic structure was historically designed around male ownership. Land, livestock, and financial decisions traditionally belonged to men. This imbalance is rooted not only in culture, but also in the deeper legacy of colonial economics. Many African nations were shaped into extraction-based economies, industries built to pull resources out, not to empower people within. In these systems, education for girls was rarely prioritized, and women were often locked into unpaid or low-paid labor. By the time nations gained independence, women were already generations behind in access to literacy, land, and leadership. Today, millions of girls still leave school early, not because they lack intelligence or ambition, but because poverty forces their families to make impossible choices. Parents may keep sons in school while daughters stay home to cook, fetch water, or care for younger siblings. For many girls, education ends before adolescence, and with it, the chance to choose their future. And so, the pattern repeats. Limited education leads to limited income, which leads to limited power politically, socially, and economically. That is why President Ibrahim Traoré points to women's conditions as the true indicator of national independence. No country can claim sovereignty while half its population lives without opportunity. But this is only the beginning of a much deeper reality, one that reveals the true weight carried by women across the continent. As we look deeper into the daily reality faced by millions of African women, the story becomes far more painful than statistics could ever capture. It is not only poverty or lack of opportunity, it is the weight of centuries-old cultural expectations that continue to hold women back, often silently and without challenge. In many communities, girls are expected to marry early, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. Their childhood ends abruptly, traded for adult responsibilities they never chose. Families believe they are protecting their daughters or following long-standing traditions, but the result is always the same. A young girl loses her education, her independence, and her voice before she ever has a chance to use it. These traditions are not always rooted in cruelty, they are rooted in survival. Yet survival becomes a trap when it denies women the chance to rise. A girl who leaves school becomes a woman with limited income. A woman with limited income becomes a mother with limited power. And a mother with limited power raises another generation of girls destined to face the same barriers. This is the cycle President Ibrahim Traoré refuses to accept. But the cultural burden does not end with early marriage. Across parts of the continent, gender-based violence remains a daily threat. For many women, violence is not a risk, it is an expectation, a normal part of life. They are taught to endure in silence. Domestic abuse goes unreported. Forced reproduction is common. In some regions, harmful practices like FGM continue because no one in power dares to confront them. These realities do not simply harm individuals, they shape entire communities. When women are silenced, families are broken. When girls are denied education, economies shrink. And when violence is accepted, the moral foundation of a society begins to erode. What makes this truly heartbreaking is not only the suffering but the silence surrounding it. The world rarely hears these stories. Governments rarely confront them. And women, generation after generation, are told to endure what should never be endured. It is here at the intersection of tradition, silence, and suffering that the story of African women reaches its emotional peak. If cultural pressure and daily violence were not already overwhelming, the reality becomes even darker when war enters the picture. Across the Sahel, Sudan, Congo, Somalia, and other conflict zones, women do not just suffer the consequences of fighting, they become the final victims of every war, long after the bullets stop. When militants attack a village, men may flee, fight, or hide. Women cannot. They stay to protect their children, their elderly parents, their homes, and in doing so, they stand directly in the path of violence. Many are forced to run with their families, carrying infants on their backs and whatever belongings they can gather in minutes. These journeys stretch across deserts, forests, and dangerous borders. Some women walk for days without food, water, or safety. And when they reach refugee camps, places meant to offer protection, they often find new forms of hardship. Overcrowded tents, limited aid, malnutrition, disease, and insecurity become part of their daily lives. The dreams they once had for themselves disappear, replaced by the instinct to simply survive until the next morning. But the most devastating reality is one the world hesitates to speak about: sexual violence as a weapon of war. Armed groups use it deliberately to terrorize communities, to break families, to humiliate entire ethnic groups. It is a method of control designed to wound not just the woman, but the identity of the community she belongs to. Victims are left with lifelong physical injuries, emotional trauma, and children born into instability and stigma. These women are not collateral damage, they are targets, and they carry a burden no one should bear. The impact ripples outward. Children raised in conflict grow up without proper education, without stability, without hope, creating a cycle that repeats itself every decade. Families collapse under the weight of trauma. Entire regions sink deeper into poverty, making recovery almost impossible. This is why the suffering of women during war is not only a humanitarian crisis, it is a national crisis. A continent cannot rise when its women are crushed by conflict. A society cannot heal when its mothers are wounded at the deepest level. And it is here that President Ibrahim Traoré's message becomes more than a statement. It becomes an alarm warning Africa and the world that ignoring women's suffering means ignoring the continent's future itself. When women are pushed to the margins of society, the consequences are not limited to their homes or families. They reshape the political and economic foundations of entire nations. The absence of women in leadership, in decision-making, and in economic ownership has created a ripple effect that continues to weaken African states from within. Across much of the continent, women remain sharply underrepresented in political institutions. They are rarely part of the councils that write laws or the cabinets that manage ministries. Policies affecting land ownership, education, healthcare, and economic development are often drafted without a single woman in the room. The result is predictable: systems that fail to understand or address women's needs. And when a nation builds its laws on the assumptions of only half its population, it builds a fragile state, one that struggles to make decisions that truly reflect its society. Economically, the picture is just as alarming. Women make up nearly half of Africa's agricultural workforce, yet many of them do not legally own the land they farm. They generate income, but they cannot use that income to secure loans because they lack collateral. They run small businesses, but they cannot scale them because banks and government programs often overlook female entrepreneurs. This structural exclusion is not accidental. It stems from generations of economic systems designed with men as the default decision-makers and women as unpaid or undervalued laborers. And when women cannot access credit, land, or financial protection, their families remain trapped in poverty regardless of how hard they work. The impact stretches further. A nation where women cannot thrive becomes a nation with limited human capital. Children raised in households strained by poverty and gender imbalance often drop out of school early. Healthcare suffers. Community development stalls. Political participation weakens. The entire social fabric becomes brittle. This is why many analysts argue that gender inequality is not just a women's issue, it is a national development crisis. When half of a country's population is systematically excluded from opportunity, the country itself stays poor, unstable, and dependent on foreign assistance. And that is why many African leaders, including President Ibrahim Traoré, insist that no country can claim sovereignty while its women remain without power. Because a system built to keep women at the bottom will inevitably keep the nation at the bottom as well. Beyond politics and economics, another crisis continues silently in the background, one that affects every family, every village, and every generation. The crushing burden of reproductive labor and the severe weakness of healthcare systems across large parts of Africa. These two forces combined create an invisible weight that women carry alone, day after day, year after year. Africa holds the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, not because women are weaker, but because the systems meant to protect them barely exist. Many expectant mothers must walk miles just to reach a clinic, only to find that the clinic has no doctor, no midwife, no electricity, no medication, and sometimes not even clean water. Giving birth becomes a gamble with death, not a celebration of life. Imagine a woman in labor, traveling on foot or in the back of an overcrowded truck, hoping to reach help in time. Imagine losing a child to complications that modern medicine could easily prevent. This is the reality for millions of mothers, and it leaves emotional scars that last a lifetime. At the same time, women are expected to bear 4, 5, or even 6 children to sustain the family or the community. They work the fields during pregnancy, care for infants while farming, and continue laboring long after their bodies are exhausted. This constant physical strain leads to chronic illness, reduced productivity, and shortened lifespans. Their strength is admired, but their suffering is ignored. And because women shoulder both the burden of labor and the responsibility of raising children, the entire nation feels the impact. When a mother is sick, the children miss school. When a mother dies during childbirth, the family collapses. When a community loses too many women, the nation loses its foundation. These tragedies are not isolated, they are symptoms of a larger structural failure. A nation that does not invest in women's health cannot achieve long-term development. A country that exhausts its mothers cannot build a strong workforce. And a society that treats childbirth as a risk, rather than a protected right, will always struggle to move forward. It becomes painfully clear why President Ibrahim Traoré insists that African nations cannot rise unless their women rise, because every national crisis from poverty to instability begins with the condition of women's lives. And that truth leads us directly to the next question. How do other nations, especially the United States, view this struggle, and why does it matter? From the perspective of the United States, the condition of women in any nation is more than a humanitarian issue. It is a direct indicator of political stability, democratic maturity, and long-term development. American policymakers, especially those familiar with global development programs, often evaluate a country by a simple measure: how does it treat its women? For many Americans over 40, this question echoes their own history, their own struggle for equality, and their own memories of a changing nation. The United States learned through its own journey that when women gain rights, opportunity expands for everyone. When women entered the workforce in larger numbers, the economy grew. When women gained political representation, laws became more inclusive. When American mothers received better health care, the health of the entire nation improved. None of these changes were gifts. They were victories earned through persistence and courage. And because of that, many Americans instinctively understand the link between women's empowerment and national strength. That is why U.S. development programs, particularly USAID, often prioritize girls' education, maternal health, and women's entrepreneurship across Africa. American diplomats and aid workers have repeatedly emphasized that reducing gender inequality is not charity. It is an investment in long-term stability. A community where women can read, work, and lead is a community less vulnerable to poverty, extremist recruitment, and political collapse. In other words, empowering women is a form of national security strategy. For older American viewers, there is also a deeply human connection. They remember the civil rights movement. They remember the struggle for women's rights in the 1960s and 1970s. They remember the turning points where society chose progress over tradition. When they look at Africa's challenges today, they see reflections of battles their own mothers and grandmothers once fought. And that is why President Ibrahim Traoré's message resonates far beyond Burkina Faso. It speaks to a universal truth Americans recognize well. A nation cannot rise while holding its women down. The United States understands this not as theory, but as lived history. Which leads to an even larger question: how does the rest of the world interpret Traoré's stance, and why are international observers paying attention now more than ever? Around the world, journalists, researchers, and political analysts have begun paying closer attention to what is unfolding in Burkina Faso, not because it is the largest or wealthiest nation in Africa, far from it, but because of the boldness of its leadership. President Ibrahim Traoré has become a surprising focal point in African news, international development reports, and social justice discussions. His message is clear, direct, and disruptive. The liberation of Africa begins with the liberation of African women. For decades, global institutions have discussed gender equality, but often through the lens of Western models, training workshops, conferences, or symbolic political appointments. Traoré breaks from this script completely. He does not speak about representation alone. He speaks about power, land ownership, access to finance, physical protection during conflict, real participation in rebuilding a nation. These priorities challenge not only local traditions but also the comfortable assumptions of international organizations that often prefer slow, incremental change. And that is why the world is divided in its response. Some global observers praise Traoré for pushing a message African leaders rarely express so publicly. They see Burkina Faso as the starting point of a broader movement, a shift toward genuine sovereignty grounded in social transformation, not slogans. These voices argue that Africa's future may very well depend on leaders willing to confront the root causes of inequality rather than merely managing its symptoms. Others, however, remain skeptical. They question whether such reforms are realistic in regions plagued by conflict, poverty, and unstable institutions. They wonder whether the global system dependent on African resources and political conformity will quietly resist any change that shifts power away from entrenched structures. And they ask whether the world is truly prepared for an Africa that demands not just independence, but self-respect. Yet one thing is undeniable. Traoré has changed the conversation. His stance has made Burkina Faso, a country often overlooked by the international community, a symbol of a new political philosophy, one where women are not accessories to national progress, but architects of it. And as this new narrative spreads across Africa and beyond, it raises a final, powerful question, one the world did not expect. What if empowering women is not just a social reform, but a strategy capable of reshaping Africa's entire balance of power? Here is the part the world did not see coming. Ibrahim Traoré is not simply defending women's rights. He is redefining what national strength means in the 21st century. For decades, African leaders were judged by military capacity, GDP numbers, or diplomatic alliances. But Traoré introduces a concept almost unheard of in global politics, that a nation's true power is measured by the condition of its women. This is the twist. Traoré is not just fighting inequality, he is building a new formula for sovereignty. He argues that when women are educated, nations become smarter. When women own land, economies expand. When women can access credit, families rise out of poverty. When women are protected in times of conflict, entire regions stabilize. And when women have political power, governments become more accountable. This is not theory, it is strategy. A long-term strategy that challenges every model imposed on Africa for the last 60 years. By placing women at the center, Traoré is effectively saying, a continent cannot be controlled if its women are empowered, because empowered women build independent households. Independent households build independent communities. Independent communities build independent nations. And independent nations cannot be manipulated by outside powers. That is why this message unsettles many observers. It is not just social reform. It is the blueprint of a new geopolitical identity, one in which Africa decides its future from within, not from the boardrooms of foreign powers. And this twist leads directly into an even bigger revelation, one that elevates Traoré from a national figure to a continental symbol. What makes this transformation even more striking is that Ibrahim Traoré is not using women's empowerment as a political slogan. He is using it as a frontline weapon in Africa's struggle against poverty, extremism, and foreign domination. This is where the world begins to understand the true depth of his strategy. In regions plagued by insurgency, it is often women who hold communities together. When they are educated, they recognize early signs of radicalization. When they are financially independent, extremist groups lose one of their key recruitment tools: desperation. When women are given real political voice, corruption becomes harder to hide. In this way, Traoré is transforming women from victims of instability into defenders of stability itself. And this shift is not going unnoticed. Across the continent, young leaders, grassroots movements, and intellectual circles are studying what is happening in Burkina Faso. They are asking whether Traoré's model centered on women, sovereignty, and dignity could become a blueprint for a new generation of African governance. In global discussions, analysts now reference Burkina Faso not as a country struggling to survive, but as a nation redefining the rules. Suddenly, a leader once dismissed by traditional powers is being spoken of as the unexpected architect of a political awakening, one rooted not in military might, but in the strength of women who have long been ignored. And so, the twist becomes clear. Empowering women is not the end of Traoré's mission. It is the beginning of a continental shift, one that could permanently alter Africa's place in the world. When we step back and look at the full picture, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. African women are not held back because they are weak. They are held back because the systems around them were built without them. And when those systems begin to change, when women gain education, land, protection, and a voice, the entire nation transforms. The family grows stronger. The village grows stronger. The economy grows stronger. A continent long underestimated begins to rise with a dignity no outsider can take away. This is why President Ibrahim Traoré speaks with such conviction. He understands that the future of Africa will be written by the women who carry its heaviest burdens. As he said with unmistakable clarity, "We did not ask to be free. We stood up and claimed it." And now the question is no longer whether African women can rise, it is whether the world is ready for what happens when they do. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story so more people can see the truth behind Africa's awakening. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. And may God bless Africa, a continent rising on the strength of its women.